Welcome to Reclaiming Dominion, where we talk about restoring godly order in our homes, churches, and nations. I'm Pastor Andrew Violet. Today we're going to discuss the three foundational spheres of dominion in society. Or to put it another way, what are the structures of hierarchy or authority that we have on earth that are recognized by God as legitimate? We all know that there is hierarchy everywhere we go, but what forms of authority are pleasing to God and which ones result in human flourishing? Now, as I mentioned, there's going to be three that we talk about today because there's basically three forms of government or authority instituted on earth that have to do with us as interacting between human beings. There's other types of authority you could probably point to and dominion over various other spheres, but what we're talking about today is social authority, how humans interact with one another. Now, before we talk about that, I first have to define what I'm talking about here by defining my terms. The first thing that you'll notice I mentioned was authority. It's not really a popular word people like to talk about today. There's a lot of people who are anti-authority. We won't really go there at this time, but I just want to define for you so we are on the same page what authority is. Authority is the power granted by God to an individual to rule for the good of the people placed under that authority. Now, all authority, according to the scriptures, has been instituted by God. Romans chapter 13 tells us, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Now, that's Romans 13, and God is showing us there that He is the one who has actually instituted every authority. Wherever there's somebody in charge that is legitimate, approved by God, the Bible says He is actually the one who has approved of those roles. So people don't self-appoint themselves, and they don't just decide to be the leader. It is actually God who gives that authority to them. Now, it's not always used properly, and sometimes people misuse their authority, and that's a whole nother thing. But the authority itself is granted by God. Now, the second word I got to define here is dominion, and it's actually the theme of my channel, which is Reclaiming Dominion. But dominion is the faithful exercising of authority in lawful ways. So wherever God grants authority over something, it is critical that those persons exercise it without neglect and also without exceeding their bounds. Unfortunately, there are traps on both sides, and we fail to maintain this sometimes. Whenever God calls somebody to a place of authority, it is important that they exercise that appropriately. We don't want to go beyond our bounds. That's when abuse happens from leaders. But you definitely don't want to also shy away from what you've been called to in your realm of authority. Because if you do that, if you neglect the authority God has given, God still holds those in those positions of authority. He still holds them responsible for how they use that authority. Even if they threw up their hands and said, I didn't want to have anything to do with it, God still holds them responsible. So we're going to talk about the three spheres of social authority or human authority and that exist here on earth that are instituted by God, and actually each one builds upon each other. The first and the most foundational is the house. The house representing a home. Sometimes we use these terms interchangeably, but the house represents the people inside of that house. It's the man, it's the woman, and it's the children. And some would say by extension it is any servants of the house. We don't really use those terms today, but it is the home under the leadership of the head of that household. So every household unit is actually designed as an authority structure ordained by God. And you can actually see this all the way back when God created the household in the beginning in Genesis. When God created man and He created woman, and it says, man shall leave father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. And this is actually the establishing of a household. Now, the authority structure in a household, there's actually a couple levels because there's children in which the parents have authority over them. But really the head of that household, according to the scriptures, is the man of that house, the husband. The Bible lays this out very clearly. In 1 Timothy 5:8, it says that if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So it speaks that to this need in men to provide for their houses, to take care of their houses, and that there's a responsibility that falls on the man of the house to make sure that he is providing for his own. The purpose for a house is education of children and business. Now, both of those things today, they kind of get removed from the household to some extent. We have a lot of people sending their kids to public schools or to private schools. So education doesn't always happen inside the home. And I'm a big advocate for homeschooling. All our kids are homeschooled. But it is important, whether you send your kids to school or are homeschooled, that you understand that the education of your children is nobody else's responsibility except for yours. So you've got to make sure that you are educating your child the way that you believe honors God. And so that is the business of the household. Actually, it's not the business of any other sphere of authority. You've got to educate your children in the ways of the Lord, and it is the place for business. Now that's the other thing under the household that often gets taken outside of the household. And I really appreciate C.R. Wiley's work on this. He has a book, an awesome book I would highly encourage you to read. It's called The Household and the War for the Cosmos. He has got other books that are awesome as well that I've read, but that one I highly recommend because in it he defines clearly, or he shows clearly, that the household has always been seen as the place for productivity, the place for business. It is always been the basic economy of our social structure. And so we still do this to some extent, even if you work outside of your household, even if you go to, say, some employer elsewhere outside of your home, you go and you make a paycheck and you bring it back to provide for your household. And so it's kind of broken up now, where people used to practice their own trades from their own houses. It still, though, is that same principle is still in effect, where you must go and you must make money to provide for your household so that your household would flourish. So education and business, they are centered in the sphere of the house. Now, I want to talk about the second sphere. Okay, so we talked about the house, but the second sphere is actually the church. And if you don't get the house right, you're not going to get any of the other spheres of authority right either. And the church builds upon that with this background of the house, of the man as the head of the house, and the husband and the wife being a team where they lead and train up their children. We see this same mentality in the church. The church is a religious structure. And in the church, you've got two groups of people. There's the elders, and then there are the disciples, or we call them Christians, or the saints. Many terms we use to describe the people, the members of the church, the attendees, the congregants, the sheep, the flock. There's a lot of different synonyms we use for this. But basically, there's the elders who are responsible for leading, and then there are the whole church as a whole, which are the disciples and the Christians. Now, the purpose for a church, that type of authority structure, that type of sphere, the purpose for the church is so that all the people who are part of it can receive true, correct doctrine, and so that they can engage in proper worship of God. If we didn't have this, we would all be on our own, having to figure things out on our own. But God actually ordained a place for these two things to meet together: right doctrine and proper worship of God, the observance of the sacraments like the Lord's Supper and baptism, and being able to sing our praises to God and have a community of faith. So this is the church. And as I've already mentioned, the authority in the church is represented by the elders. And they actually function very much like a father in a house, except the elder's job isn't productivity, the business of the house. That's not the purpose of the church, and it's not education primarily of the children. The purpose of the church is for the elders to safeguard right doctrine and right worship practices. That's why we receive teachings from the church. And ultimately, we have to be in agreement with whatever your local church is, whatever they teach. It's important that you submit yourself to that because you are being a part of their faith community. So Hebrews 13, verse 7 talks about this. It says, obey your leaders and submit to them. And that word leader is where we get the elder from. That would be the same role there. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. So understand this, that there is the household structure, and the head of that household, the man, he is responsible for what's happening in that house. Ultimately, God will judge that man for what is happening in that house. He's going to, on the day of judgment, he's going to bring the man of the house up and say, how did you handle the household I gave you? But it will also be the same in the church, because God's given the authority to the elders, or we call them pastors, and they're responsible to make sure right doctrine and right worship practices are continuing faithfully in the church. So this is why the scriptures say, hey, submit to that. They're there for your good, in the same way that fathers or husbands are there in the household for your good. The third sphere I want to talk about today, though, is the civil magistrate, or we like to call it the government. And in all our countries, this might be a little different. I live in Canada and pastor here in Canada, and we have one form of government. I also am an American citizen as well, and I grew up in the States, and they have a slightly different form of government. But everywhere you go around the world, there are different systems of government. But what's important is that those who are in authority in the government, those who have been chosen to rule that country, they are actually exercising a role that has been appointed by God. It's not our idea. It is actually God's idea to have human authority, but they have a very specific function, and we can see this laid out in Romans chapter 13. In Romans 13, I already referenced this, but it says that every person must be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. And is actually in that passage referring to our governmental leaders, our presidents, our prime ministers, our kings, those who have been chosen to rule the nation. But in that chapter, Romans 13, it actually defines out very carefully what the role of a civil magistrate is to do. And it is primarily to bear the sword, to take up the sword to punish evildoers, those who break the law, those who are causing harm to other human beings outside of a house and outside of a church. It is in society where violence is on display, and theft and fraud. These things are the responsibility not of houses, not of heads of houses, and it's not the responsibility of elders and pastors. It is actually the responsibility of the civil magistrate to make sure that punishment is due. Now, it is important here to note that civil magistrates are appointed by God. They are not necessarily that God picks every single person in that role. It very well might be, but that's not necessarily what is meant by this. When we're referring to the civil magistrate being appointed by God, what we mean is that role is ordained by God. And so God approves of that role. And God expects every single person who functions in that role to uphold his law. And that is across the board. So every king, every president, every prime minister, their duty is to make sure that the evildoer gets punished, to make sure that they're tough on crime, to make sure, and in so doing, it will actually create a free and a society that is healthy and peaceful, because people will be afraid to do evil. And their standard that they uphold is the law of God, and it's found in God's word. They don't get to write a new standard. Governments don't get to come up with their own view of morality. They don't get to redefine what God has already said is the way the world has been made, but they are responsible to uphold it and to make sure that there is fear that falls on people who would take matters into their own hands and do evil to another person. When each of these spheres, the house, the church, and the civil magistrate, when each of these spheres are operating as they ought to, we have peace in society. When one of these spheres either goes beyond, or they either grab for more power, or they neglect their power, we have breakdowns. And so it's important to maintain the integrity of each, understanding what each one is for, so that way we can apply ourselves as leaders in each of those spheres, and that we can pray for those leaders, and so that we can also submit to them appropriately. Just for example, I want you to think this through. If we got this mixed up, and we do get this mixed up in culture often, and it's kind of a mess, which is why I'm even doing this video right now. But picture a household that claim to have the authority of the civil magistrate. Well, what you would see is individual households taking up arms to have vengeance when they feel like they need to on somebody. What a messy society that would be if every father and every head of household took up a firearm and went and shot somebody every time that they think that they broke the law. I mean, we would have a vigilante system. We don't want that. But we also don't want the opposite. We don't want the civil magistrate responsible for the education of our children, and we don't want the civil magistrate responsible for the business in the household, because then you actually take away the authority that the household has. So it's important each one is defined, and that we honor those God-given, distinct authorities that he has given us, and we will be blessed.